Last time we spoke about the May 4th movement of 1919. The Jinan Revolution of 1911 had sparked the May 4th movement, marked by nationalism, anti-imperialism, and a quest for modernization. Disillusioned with traditional values and foreign encroachments, Chinese intellectuals, students, and workers embraced Western ideals, particularly Marxism, to reform Chinese society. The movement led to the emergence of the Chinese Communist Party, and a broader alliance against warlordism and Japanese imperialism. Tensions arose between reformist liberalism and revolutionary Marxism, reflecting debates over China's path to progress. Despite many setbacks, the May 4th movement's legacy persisted, shaping China's political landscape and laying the groundwork for future revolutionary action. It is truly an understatement to say it was a watershed moment in modern Chinese history. But underneath it all lurked a brand new era, one that was to be fought and ruled by warlords. This episode is Meet the Northern Warlords. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I just released part 4 of my series on General Kanji Ishiwara versus Hideki Tojo. It's the last part in that series that was originally an exclusive on my Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And over there you can find exclusive podcasts. The latest podcast over there is a 2-part series on the wacky Battle of Castle Itta, a battle that saw Americans, 1 SS officer, some Wehrmacht, a few French prisoners, fight off an entire squad of Waffen-SS. It was one of the last battles of World War II in Europe. And I tell you, it is a very bizarre story, so go check it out. How to even begin? I am staring at roughly 10 tabs of books open alongside numerous scripts I had written nearly a year ago about China's warlord era. I had already written an extensive series that I also molded into a long-form documentary that can be found on the Pacific War channel, titled China's Warlord Era. Oh, and by the way, you can also find it in audio form on all podcast platforms. Just check out the Pacific War channel. However, I realize now I really did not dig deep enough, specifically on who exactly were the warlords. It's true, I covered their numerous battles, I made jokes about them, but I did not really dig deep enough into their backgrounds. To be honest, their backgrounds are quite fascinating. They were all kooky characters in their own right. Thus, I thought what better idea than to start off the warlord era by introducing some of the warlords and their cliques. But because there is literally so many warlords, I'm going to have to probably do this one in 2 parts. So, this episode is going to be on the Northern Warlords, and the next episode will be on the Southern ones. And it makes sense to do it like that because there was a North-South divide during the warlord era. So after the death of Yuan Shikai, China underwent a major shift from being a state-dominated civil bureaucracy, overseen by a central authority, to military-dominated regions. These regions were dominated by the warlords, whom, in the words of American political scientist Lucien Pai, were instinctively suspicious, quick to suspect that their interests might be threatened, hard-headed, devoted to the short run, and impervious to the idealistic abstractions. Most of the warlords came from military backgrounds, having gone through the new-style military colleges of the late 19th and early 20th century, with foreign instructors. Most of the warlords were extremely brutal, not just to their enemies, but to civilians and their own troops. They killed without a second thought, their own men if they suspected insubordination. They used horrible torture tactics like suspending a victim by the neck in bamboo or in wooden cages, breaking knees, slicing limbs, branding, and so forth. If railway workers tried to go on strike, a warlord would often execute a few of them to get them to go back to work. A British diplomat in Sichuan province witnessed 2 mutineers being publicly hacked to death with their hearts and livers cut out. Another 2 were burned to death, and others had slits cut into their bodies into which was inserted burning candles before they were hacked to pieces. Warlords had to depend on subordinate officers, thus personal loyalty was of vital importance. Many warlords would be betrayed by their officers, who would often be bribed by other warlords. During the warlord period, there was a balance of power. For those who don't know, the balance of power theory suggests states, or in this case warlord regions, may secure their own survival by preventing any other state from gaining enough military power to dominate all others. So basically in Europe, historically you see this with Britain, France, and Spain. 2 of the states would always join forces against the largest state to keep everybody in balance. During the warlord era, where there were numerous cliques with their own regional bases, the balance of power becomes quite complicated. But most books, or even YouTube videos for that matter, focus on 3 big ones that we will get into quite soon. Now, the warlord's entire power scheme relied on their military. Thus, it was a precious thing to conserve. Going to war with another clique might increase one's sphere of influence, but it might also weaken one's military so much they might become vulnerable to attacks from other cliques. If you've played a game of Risk, think of it exactly like that. When do you unleash all of your cards? When do you attack your enemy? When do you hold back? When do you form a, kind of a diplomacy, telling your friend to trust you, but then you backstab him? That really is China's warlord era. This is further complicated by all the intricacies of the 20th century. This is the age of industry, economic power, trade, and so forth. Not all the warlords held regions with economic capacity or logistical strength to wage long-term wars. Some needed decisive knockout blows, the quick war. As you can imagine, there are thousands of variables at play, making it nearly impossible for any given clique to dominate all of China. Yet, all of them wanted to. The warlord era played out during a time when railroads were the fastest and cheapest means of transporting troops. Thus, capturing railroads was of vital importance. This was also an age directly after World War I, where the armored train was king. An armored train full of artillery and machine guns could land troops and perform fire support for them in battle. One warlord in particular would make very good use of this. Warlord armies consisted of common soldiers, and more often than not, bandits. These were the grunt types. They had no loyalty to anyone. Sellswords, as you say. Many joined warlord armies as a means to an end. Everyone has to eat. Often a bandit became a soldier during times of war. Then during times of peace, they went back to banditry. And it was quite a vicious cycle. Warlord armies were a plague upon the populations they came into contact with. They plundered, raped, took hostages for money, took women into sexual slavery. They murdered as much as they wanted. After all, who was going to stop them? The police? Warlords often looted the countryside as a means to pay their own troops. Peasants often joined a warlord army, fought a battle, became captured by the enemy, who simply enlisted them. Yes, warlords often incorporated POWs into their own armies. A system that would most definitely bite them in the ass, quite often. And since I am, as you know, since I always bring it up, the Pacific War channel over on YouTube, I have to mention a rather famous figure of the Pacific War here, Vinegar Joseph Stilwell, because he went to China as an attaché in the 1920s and he got to see warlordism for the first hand. In 1926, he inspected a warlord unit and he estimated about 20% of the men were 4'6". The average age was roughly 14 years old, and many walked barefoot. Do note he was in Shandong province, one of the hardest hit provinces during this time. And the units he had been inspecting probably were not the greatest warlord armies to be seen. Warlord armies were composed of infantry, cavalry, artillery, sometimes armor, and even air forces for the lucky big guys. They were organized like any modern military, with commanding officers over various units. They were composed of regular units, typically the core of a warlord's army. These were the professionally trained soldiers, often equipped with modern firearms and artillery, the very backbone of the army, so to say. Then there were the irregular militias. These were local recruit types. They were less trained, less equipped, but like in any good army, they provided numbers, and numbers are a strength of their own. They were more prevalent in the rural areas, where manpower was always needed to keep control. Next, there were foreign advisors and even foreign mercenaries. Some warlords hired foreign military advisors and mercenaries to bolster their strength. The advisors came from any of the great powers, but most especially Japan, Britain, France, and Germany. The Russian Civil War also added a ton of White Russians to the mix. Some warlords took advantage of hiring full White Russian regiments like Jang Zulan. For those unaware, during the Russian Civil War, the communists would be referred to as the Reds, or the Red Army for their military, and then there was the White Movement, whose military, as just a blanket term, would have been referred to as the White Army. The White Army represented numerous different factions, all fighting to get rid of the communists, to reclaim Russia for various other reasons, and they would lose the Civil War. Many of them would actually migrate east into Siberia, and some cross the border into China, and many were hired. A lot of them had very specific expertise. To give a good example, entire regiments that knew how to operate and maintain armored trains were hired by Jang Zulan, who became pretty much the greatest warlord at using armored trains. Jang Zulan also hired White Army nurses, who trained his nurses, and he basically had the best medical unit for quite a while. Many like Jang Zulan would use foreign mercenaries to terrifying effect. In 1916, China had roughly 500,000 soldiers. By 1922, this tripled. Then it tripled again in 1924. Such manpower costs money, thus warlords enacted large taxes to keep their armies going. One way of raising funds were specific taxes called lijin. It was a form of internal tariff, placed on the transit of goods being traded between provinces. One example of lijin was seen in Sichuan province, where 27 different taxes were placed upon salt and paper going down the Yangtze River to Shanghai. It was taxed 11 different times by various warlords to the sum of 160% of its total value. Warlords also took enormous loans, further complicating the economic order. Many warlords got into the black market, stealing, cultivating, and selling opium. Countless warlords faced insane inflation situations, seeing them constantly printing more and more money. As a Canadian under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, I have no idea what that is like. Warlords were not all well educated. Thus, the illiterate warlord of Manchuria, Jang Zulan, was facing increasing prices, obviously caused by inflation, but he assumed it was the result of greedy merchants, and he began executing them. Yes, not all the warlords were the brightest of the bunch. All of these money problems occurred because men and equipment were needed. Warlords bought their military arms typically from foreign nations. They purchased weapons of all sorts from nations like Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Thus, there was a plethora of different weapons. For example, for rifles, many used the domestic manufactured Hanyang 88 and Mauser, while also importing rifles like the German Mauser-Gewehr 98, British Lee Enfield, the French Chichat rifle, and the Italian Cadcano M1891. For handguns, the most popular was by far the Mauser C96. If you look for any pictures of warlords or their troops, you will always see this pistol. For submachine guns, apparently the Bergmann MP28 was a favorite. But of course, so was the Thompson submachine gun. And the MP18 were also liked. For machine guns, there was the Maxim, the Chachot, Browning, Vickers, MG08, the Lewis gun, Hotchkiss M1909. Honestly, there was quite a lot, too many to list. Bayonets were bought and forged en masse alongside a variety of swords and sabers. The Chinese did prefer the Dao or the Jian for cavalry and ceremonies. Armored cars and trucks were bought en masse. Armored trains were employed by a few warlords, like I keep mentioning, by Jang Zulan. Jang Zulan managed to buy some Renault FT tanks in the later 1920s. All the big warlords scrambled to get their hands on World War I tanks and aircraft, though few used these effectively in battle. In the case of aircraft, they really served only as reconnaissance. Now let's talk about the warlords and their cliques. There were hundreds of warlords. I can't go through all of them. But what I will do is name the larger guys. And throughout the series, I will pepper in the smaller ones as I can. Now first, the origin of the warlords is of course the father of warlords, Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai built up the strongest army in China, the Beiyang army, that outlasted him. Many of Yuan Shikai's officers would become warlords, and their loyal followers made up the cliques. Two officers very close to Yuan Shikai were Duan and Feng. Both men began their military careers in the Tianjin Military Academy, a school established by Li Hangzhang, back in 1885. Duan Qirei's grandfather had served in Li Hangzhang's army, thus he was very much a military son. Feng came from a family of landowners who had fallen on some hard times. He failed to obtain his second civil service degree, dashing any hopes to gain a post in the civilian bureaucracy, so, like many others, he turned to the military. Both Duan and Feng gained good reputations, prompting Yuan Shikai to bring them into his inner circle. Both served him faithfully during the Xinhai Revolution, and they were rewarded with high office positions in his new government. Duan received the military governorship over Hunan and Hubei, and Feng received military governorship over Jiangsu. When Yuan Shikai died, Li Yuanhong took the presidency, actually forced to do so by Duan Qirui, who had become premier, and Feng became the vice president. The Beiyang government henceforth basically served at the whim to whichever warlord held the strongest army, and the largest presence within Beijing at any given time. Now leaderless, the Beiyang army broke apart. Its regiments and divisions fell under the control of various warlords in northern China, who claimed them for their private armies. Now I know it gets a bit confusing, but I want to make this a point. These armies were all still part of the Beiyang army. Officially, there were no quote-unquote cliques or warlords. China was just kind of pretending that it had this appropriate government and this universal appropriate army. But the reality was, within it, there were these cliques. The warlords sought to increase their power by increasing the size of their own personal armies. This also resulted in the creation of major factions, better known as cliques. Duan Qirui became the founder of the Anwei clique. It was called this because the majority of its most influential members came from Anwei, including Duan. This clique had close ties to Japan. In previous episodes, I mentioned Duan Qirei's secret Nishihara loans. This was done to bolster this clique's army. The Anwei clique organized themselves very early on, and they were more politically sophisticated than their rivals. The clique had a political wing known as the Anfu Club, meaning Peace and Happiness Club. Basically, this was a group of Beijing politicians who favored Duan Qirui, and they tried to mold the political order his way. There was also a financial wing to this clique known as the New Communications Clique, led by Tao Rulin, who was a rival to Liang Shiyu's old communications clique, part of the Cantonese clique. And yes, this gets more and more confusing. The Anwei clique basically became the biggest clique at the very offset, and they would be led by multiple figures over quite a few years. Now, there were many Beiyang officers not allowed into the Anwei clique. In the Beiyang army, as in any army, countless men had been overlooked for promotions by those like Duan Qirui, and they became quite bitter about this. These disgruntled officers felt Duan Qirui and others had snubbed them, and they gradually rallied behind Feng, forming the other Juli clique. The Juli clique had its power base in Jiangsu, Jiangxi, and Hubei. The Juli clique was Western-oriented, relying on Western nations for funding and arms. Unlike the Anwei clique, early on the Juli clique lacked strong bonds, thus they were more likely to abandon or betray another. They would be led by multiple figures, but no one would be as popular as Wu Peifu. Now, as I very much know, after creating my own Warlord series on the Pacific War Channel, I got a ton of comments about Wu Peifu. He was a fan favorite. Wu Peifu was born in Shandong province, and he received a traditional Confucian education. Most would argue Wu Peifu was a Confucian scholar, turned soldier in fact. It seems the Japanese victory over China in 1895 persuaded Wu Peifu to join the military. He enrolled in one of the new military academies at the time, the Baoding Military Academy in Beijing, and he graduated in 1903 as a second lieutenant in the Beiyang Army. 3 years later, he was assigned to Tao Quen's 3rd Division. That sprang a 20-year relationship between the two men. Tao Quen took Wu Peifu under his wing. He would become the leader of the Juli clique after Feng Zhang. However, Tao Quen was heavily invested in political matters. Because of this, he relied heavily on Wu Peifu to manage military affairs, and this paid off big time, as Wu Peifu became one of modern China's greatest military strategists. Think Lelouch from Code Geass. If you get that reference, you are an awesome person, a man of culture. Wu Peifu earned the epithet the Jade Marshal because of his military and intellectual prowess. He won many battles and campaigns over rival warlords, often outmaneuvering or outwitting them. He was also very committed to maintaining integrity and order within his military. He emphasized professionalism and adhered to the codes of conduct, earning a lot of respect amongst his men and the Chinese population in general. To many he looked elegant and composed, resembling the qualities of jade, thus the nickname. He would brush shoulders with other famous Juli clique warlords, such as Sun Feng and Yuan, but honestly the list is much larger than that. Now if you read about the warlord era, typically they display 3 large cliques in the north who influence most of the era itself. These are the Anwei clique, the Juli clique, and of course the Feng clique. They basically form a balance of power in North China. I should also probably note, China is facing a north-south divide during the warlord era, so you often hear the cliques being called northern faction cliques or southern faction cliques. The Feng clique's sphere of influence was Manchuria, and thus they were heavily backed by Japan. Like Wu Peifu, the founder of the Feng clique is also a fan favorite. His name was Jang Zulan, the Tiger of Manchuria. Jang Zulan was born in Haicheng, in southern Feng province, modern-day Liaoning. He was born to a poor family. He received very little formal education, but when old enough, he ran a stable at an inn. He was a slender, kind of frail man, with a droopy mustache and a very soft voice. He enlisted in the military during the First Sino-Japanese War, learning how to be a soldier, and then he returned to Fengxian, where some would say he became a honghuzi. There is a story, most likely made up by Jang Zulan, mind you, that he was on a hunting trip when he came across a wounded honghuzi on horseback. He killed the man, stole his horse, and he took the honghuzi's identity for himself. He gradually organized a small militia force and defended the locality, and this became the nucleus of his personal army. Scholars are unsure whether Jang Zulan was ever a real honghuzi or not. Some claim he led a honghuzi gang, others state he was accused of being honghuzi because his local militia was not a regular military unit. During the Boxer Rebellion, his gang joined the Imperial Army, and afterwards they worked as security escorts for traveling merchants. During the Russo-Japanese War, his men worked as mercenaries for the Imperial Japanese Army. After the war, he reached an agreement with the military governor of Fengxian province to have his forces become a regiment in the regular Qing army. During the Xinhai Revolution, many declared independence movements in Manchuria. The pro-Manchu governor used Jang Zulan's regiment to set up a Manchurian People's Peacekeeping Council. This was simply done to intimidate and threaten the revolutionaries. But for Jang Zulan's role, he was awarded Vice Ministry of Military Affairs. When Yuan Shikai was trying to seize the presidency from Dr. Sun Yat-sen, Jang Zulan supported him and he received military provisions for doing so. Jang Zulan murdered a number of leading figures in Mukden, and he was promoted multiple times by the ailing Qing dynasty. When it became obvious Yuan Shikai was going to take over, Jang Zulan threw his lot in with him. After 1911, Jang Zulan helped quell the rebellion, earning a rank of lieutenant general. Then when Yuan Shikai declared himself emperor, Jang Zulan was one of the very few who actually supported him. For this, Yuan Shikai promoted him to the military governor of Fengxian. In 1916, when Yuan Shikai had put down rebellions in the southern provinces, Jang Zulan supported the effort. However, when Duan Qirui sent a military governor to replace him, Jang Zulan went to the Kwangtung army for help. With the Japanese help, Jang Zulan got rid of many men who would try to take his authority over Fangxian province. When Yuan Shikai died, Jang Zulan was in the perfect position to become a warlord in his region. By 1919, he managed to gain the position of Inspector General over all 3 provinces of Manchuria, and he had appointed loyal subordinates all over Manchuria to make sure he was in control. By 1920, he was the de facto supreme leader of Manchuria, and he controlled the Fangxian army. Jang Zulan would dominate the Fangxian clique nearly for its entire existence, only to be replaced later on by his son, Jang Zulan, after his death. The Fangxian clique produced many warlords, the most notorious being, of course, the dog-meat general, Jang Zulan. I won't get into it here, but honestly, I plan on doing an entire episode to cover Jang Zulan's life, alongside another character. It's actually probably going to be the next episode. It'll be hilarious and horrifying. The next warlord clique was the Shanxi clique of Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai was born in the late 19th century in Wutai County of Xinzhou, Shanxi. His family were mostly bankers and merchants. He himself worked in his father's bank, and he pursued a traditional Confucian education. However, economic depression in the region prompted Yuan Shikai to join a military school in Taiyuan. There he was introduced to Western sciences, and in 1904 he went to Japan to study at the Tokyo Shimbugaikou, a military preparatory academy. He enlisted in the Japanese Army Academy and graduated in 1909. Yan studied in Japan for 5 years, and he was impressed by Japan's modernization efforts. He observed much of what could and what would later be used to modernize Shanxi. Yan concluded Japan had successfully modernized largely because of its government's abilities to mobilize its populace in support of its policies, and the close respectful relationship that existed in its military and civilian populations. In 1910, Yan wrote a pamphlet warning China that she would be in danger of being overtaken by Japan unless she developed a form of Bushido. Now, before going to Japan, Yan had been disgusted with the wide-scale corruption of Shanxi officials. He believed the Qing dynasty's hostility towards modernization and industrialization led to its downfall. While in Japan, Yan met with Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and he joined his Tongmenghui. When Yan came back to China, he was assigned divisional command of the new army in Shanxi. Despite his post, Yan actually covertly worked to overthrow the Qing dynasty. During the Xinhai Revolution, Yan led a local revolutionary force to drive out the Qing loyalist troops in the province, and he proclaimed its independence. Yan Xisen hoped to join forces with another prominent Shanxi revolutionary named Wu Lujin to resist Yuan Shikai's dominance over northern China. However, Wu Lujin was assassinated just before Yan was elected military governor. Yan tried to resist, but Yuan Shikai's Beiyang army overwhelmed Shanxi. Yan only survived by withdrawing further and further north, forming alliances with neighboring Shanxi provinces. Yan managed to avoid a military confrontation with Yuan Shikai, thus preserving his own little base of power. Although Yan Xisen was friends with Dr. Sun Yat-sen, he did not support his 1913 Second Revolution, and instead he got closer to Yuan Shikai. Because of this, Yuan Shikai allowed him to retake his post as military governor over Shanxi. Yan used this post to build a personal army, and by the time of Yuan Shikai's death, he solidified his control over Shanxi. Now, a little bit about Shanxi province. It was one of the poorest provinces in China. Yan believed unless he modernized and revived its economy, Shanxi would simply succumb to rival warlords. As Yan watched from the sidelines in 1919, he saw his province simply could not compete with the bigger boys. Thus, he took up a policy of neutrality. While the warlord era was raging on, he instead exclusively worked to modernize Shanxi, particularly developing its resource sector. Yan's governance of Shanxi led him to being dubbed the model governor by foreigners. In 1918, there was a bubonic plague outbreak in northern Shanxi, taking the lives of nearly 3,000 people within just 2 months. Yan dealt with this by issuing instructions on modern germ theory and plague management to his provincial officials. He told his populace the plague was caused by germs that were being breathed through their lungs, that the disease was incurable, and the only way to thwart it was by social distancing. He ordered his officials to keep infected family members and friends, even entire infected communities, quarantined, by threat of police if necessary. Yan also sought foreign doctors to help suppress the epidemic. When Yan was in Japan, he had spent a lot of time in a hospital, where he saw x-rays, microscopes, and other medical equipment for the first time, and it seems it greatly impressed him. The epidemic prompted Yan to modernize Shanxi's medicine industry, funding the Research Society for Advancement of Chinese Medicine in Taiyuan in 1921. The school promoted both Western and Chinese medicine, teaching courses in German, Japanese, and English. While Yan would be an isolationist for most of the warlord era, he did have a large role in the very end of it. The next northern clique is one I don't want to talk too much about because they only come into the scene later on. There is also the fact the leader of this faction happens to be the rival of Jang Zulan. And like I said, I think I might make the next episode, or at least a future episode, a comparison of the two figures, because I think it'd be hilarious. What you should know is they were the Kuomintang. They were basically a spin-off of the Kuomintang. They were more or less a branch of the Kuomintang, but located in the north. The clique was formed by Feng Yuxiang, known as the Christian General. And again, I don't want to say too much, but this guy was kind of funny. He used to check the fingernails of his troops before battle. No joke, there is footage of it on YouTube, you can go watch it. Feng Yuxiang's Kuomintang would end up being based in northwestern Hubei province. The next northern clique was known as the Ma clique, or the Three Ma's of the Northwest. This clique goes back to our episode on the Dungan Revolt. The Ma clique traces back to the Qing general Dong Fuxiang, the same man who had fought during the Dungan Revolt and saved Empress Dowager Cixi during the Boxer Rebellion. He commanded Hui armies whose commanders went on to found the Ma clique, such as Ma Anliang and Ma Fuxiang. During the Xi'an Revolution, Ma Anliang led 20 Hui battalions to defend the Qing dynasty by attacking Shaanxi, where the revolutionaries led by Zhang Fenghui sprang up. Ma Anliang failed to capture Shaanxi, and when Puyi abdicated, Ma agreed to join the new republic. Now, unlike Ma Anliang, Ma Fuxiang did not fight for the Qing, but rather for the revolutionaries. Ma Fuxiang refused to join the invasion of Shaanxi and instead declared independence of Gansu from Qing control. Because of this, Ma Fuxiang was rewarded military governorship over Ningxia by Yuan Shikai. Ma Liang was the founder of the Ma clique, but he died in 1918, leaving the mantle to the de facto leader of the Muslims in the northwest part of China, to Ma Fuxiang. The Ma clique controlled Qinghai, Gongsu, and Ningxia. Its three most prominent members were Ma Bufang, Ma Hongkui, and Ma Hongbin, known as the Xibei San Ma, Three Ma's of the Northwest. The Ma clique would fight the Kuomintang and later the Xinjiang clique during the Warlord era wars. The next northern clique was the Xinjiang clique, with their power base obviously being in Xinjiang. One thing that is unique to this clique was that some of their leaders were from outside the province. In 1907, the Yunnanese Yang Zulan was appointed governor over Xinjiang. He received support from Ma Yuanzhang and a Sufi Jarrah sheikh, who enabled him to raise a massive Hui Muslim army, primarily from Jarrah communities. Like Ma Liang, Yang Zulan was a Manchu loyalist. Neither men trusted the revolutionaries. When the Xi'an Revolution broke out, like Ma Liang, Yang Zulan fought for the Qing. After Puyi's abdication, Yang Zulan supported Yuan Shikai becoming emperor, simply because he believed monarchy was the best system for China. Thus, Yang Zulan invited a bunch of anti-Yuan leading officials to a banquet, and he decapitated them all. Yuan Shikai rewarded him with the first rank of count during his brief tenure as emperor. After Yuan Shikai's death, Li Yuanheng assigned Fan Yaolang to observe Yang Zulan to see if he could be replaced. Yang Zulan was not an idiot. He made sure to recognize whichever faction at any given time controlled the Beiyang government to avoid any troubles. He kept his rule over Xinjiang relatively peaceful, at least in terms of the warlord era. When the Russian Civil War broke out, he remained lukewarm towards the Soviet Union, because the reality was, Xinjiang had always been economically dependent on Russia. Under his leadership, Yuxiang formed a lot of deals with the Soviets, independent of the Beiyang government. To complicate things, certain Ma's like Ma Fuxiang were also members of the Xinjiang clique, and they held military positions under Yang Zengxin. Yang Zengxin controlled his province with an iron fist, relying heavily on Hui Muslim forces to keep conflict at bay. He had absolute power, and he had a funny habit of keeping the radio station keys on him at all times so that he could read every single message that aired, making sure to get rid of any parts he did not approve of beforehand. Because of the geographical location of Xinjiang, the clique did not have much influence on the warlord era versus others. Now, the last northern clique is honestly one I really don't consider a real clique, but then again, you could say the same thing about many others. This clique would be called the Manchu Restorationists, kind of like a Qing version of the White Lotus Society. They were prominent figures who simply wanted to bring back the Qing dynasty after the Xinhai Revolution. And again, I know this is probably getting annoying because I keep saying this, I really don't want to get into this one because it's actually going to involve much of the story in probably 2 episodes or so. But there is a wild and rather comical guy. His name was Zhang Shun. He had the nickname the Pig-tailed General. He would be the de facto leader of this clique, and I guess just a bit of a teaser, he technically would overthrow the Republic and usher in a Manchu restoration for about a few days. And trust me, we're going to get into that story. It's going to be a lot of fun. But stating that has been all the Northern Warlords and their respected cliques. In the next episode or 2, we will cover the Southern Warlords. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Do you want a more visual representation of the Warlord era? All of these places on a nice, beautiful map with individual banners and colors assigned to each warlord? Please go over to the Pacific War channel and check out the Warlord era documentary. It's nearly 2 hours long. It is broken down into multiple episodes if you just want to watch those, but I do recommend the documentary. It breaks down all the warlords, all of the battles they faced, and it, has my cringy memes. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel where you can find exclusive podcasts. Over there, I just released part 2 on a 2-part series on the wacky Battle of Castle Ita. The battle that saw Americans, Wehrmacht, some French prisoners, and a single SS officer fight an entire squad of Waffen-SS. You heard that right, it is one of the most bizarre battles of World War II. Please go check it out. I think I covered roughly 60% of the Northern Warlords and their respectful cliques. But in the next episode, I literally decided just now, I will tell the tale of 2 Northern Warlords. 1, an angel. 1, a devil. I hope you are ready for a more comedic and horrifying episode, for we will be talking about Feng Yuxiang and Zhang Zongchang, the dog meat general.